The woman with the patterned skin never spoke a word, but her eyes held a whole library of secrets. The world saw a strange drawing, a curiosity for their books, but I knew she was a mind sharp as a new-forged blade. What they stole from her wasn't just her name on a paper. It was the right to be seen as a person, plain and simple. Tonight, I'll tell you how she took back her own story, line by careful line. How does a living picture break free from the frame someone else built around her? I trace the worn edges of this old faded etching with my thumb. Lord, it's been so long since I held this, it feels like a whisper of dust now. This here plate, it was one of many, you see. They used to make these things, these pictures, to show folks what they called wonders. But mostly, they made them to show folks what they thought was strange, what they could point at for a nickel. This one, it shows her. The patterned enigma, they called her. She was a quiet thing, always in the dim corners of the big tent, back where the light didn't quite reach. The air there always smelled of damp sawdust and something else, something stale and trapped like old dreams. The circus wasn't a place for dreaming, not for most of them. It was a machine, always moving, always needing to show something new to the paying crowd. And her, with her skin like a map of the stars, she was just another part of that show. They'd pose her, still as a statue, sometimes by a painted jungle scene, sometimes just against a plain black cloth. Her skin, it truly was something to behold. Dark patches, light patches, all woven together like a quilt made by the Lord's own hand. But the men who came with their sketchbooks and their copper plates, they didn't see the beauty. They saw a thing to measure, a curiosity to draw out and put on paper. They saw a specimen, not a soul. They'd sit her in that dim corner, and the scratching of their pens on paper would be the only sound for hours, save for the distant rumble of the crowd outside, waiting for the next marvel. They wanted to put her in their books, these learned men, to show the world what was different. But their drawings, they had a way of twisting the truth, making her look less like a person and more like a fright, less like a woman and more like a beast from some far-off land. They were stealing her very self, one careful line at a time, turning her into something she wasn't, all for a book's page. She was just a picture to them, a thing they owned and could print 1,000 times over. What can a silent woman learn when everyone believes she sees nothing at all? The air in that tent corner always felt thick, heavy with the damp earth and the faint, sweet smell of sawdust. It wasn't the good, fresh kind, but the old, used stuff, trod down by so many feet. Days after the first drawings, they brought her back to that same spot. This time, there was a man with a serious face and tiny, sharp tools. Mr. Silas, they called him, though he rarely spoke a kind word to anyone, least of all to the folks he was meant to be drawing. She stood there, still as a statue, just like they told her. Her skin, marked like a grand puzzle, was what they wanted to capture. Mr. Silas would hold up his small, shiny calipers, cold metal touching her arm, her cheek, her forehead. He'd measure the distance between a dark patch and a light one, then scratch it down on a plate of copper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. That sound like a beetle digging into old wood. It was the only thing louder than the distant murmur of the crowd outside. They were already lining up, eager to see the marvels inside, never knowing the quiet work that went into making a person into a marvel. She never flinched, not once. Her eyes, though, They weren't still. They watched Mr. Silas's hands, the way he held his fine-tipped stylus, the angle he used to make a line. She saw how he moved his head to catch the light just so, to make the patterns on her skin look sharper, stranger, more like a map of some faraway, wild place. He wasn't drawing a woman. He was drawing a specimen. Every careful line he etched was a claim, a mark of ownership on something he believed was just another part of nature's strange collection. My old eyes ain't what they used to be, but I can still see the sharpness in these lines. They meant to cut her out of herself, I reckon. Tried to make her a thing, not a person. It's hard to watch a body be turned into a picture, especially when that picture ain't true to the soul. The light would shift through the canvas, a yellow dust dancing in the beams. Mr. Silas would pause, then move her a bit, just a turn of the head, a tilt of the chin, to catch the light exactly as he wanted. He spoke in low grunts, more to himself than to her, about anatomical accuracy and scientific truth. But the truth he was after wasn't her truth. It was the truth of a book, a catalog of oddities, a way to put her in a box even when she stood free. She just kept watching, quiet as a mouse, soaking in every scratch, every measurement, every cold calculation. How do you fight a picture when the artist believes every line is the truth? I hold this etching up to the dim lamplight, squinting. They always made her look, they made her look like a beast. This here etching is one of the kinder ones, I suppose, but it's still a lie. That little office behind the big tent, it was a cramped place, smelling of sharp, fresh ink and the damp wood of the press. You could hear the distant murmur of the carnival folks, but in that room, it was just the groan and clatter of the heavy machine. Mr. Grimsby, the manager, he stood by the press, his face red from the heat, watching the pages come out. Each page held a picture of her, the patterned enigma, but it wasn't truly her at all. Her real skin, it was like a quilt of dark and light, a wonder to see. But on these pages, in these catalogs of nature's sins, as they called them, she was twisted, her features sharpened, her patches made to look like scales, like some creature from a bad dream. The paper piled up, sheet after sheet, each one carrying that same cruel picture, ready to be bound into books. These books, they went all over, I reckon, telling folks a lie about who she was. They wanted to make sure everyone saw her as a thing to gawk at, not a person with thoughts and feelings. She stood quiet, like always, near the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. Her eyes, though, they weren't quiet. They watched the ink spread on the paper. They watched the big press groan and stamp. She saw how fast the pictures were made, how easily they could be sent out into the world. It was a factory, that little room, turning her truth into a lie, over and over again. She saw how they built her cage out of paper and ink, making sure folks would believe what they printed, not what their own eyes might tell them. Can a person ever escape a lie that is printed in 1,000 books? That Mr. Grimsby, he was a cold one, all numbers and no heart. He kept everything in ledgers, you see, made it all seem so proper. I sigh, placing the etching face down on my lap, feeling the slick, cool surface beneath my palm. His office was a cramped little box behind the main tent, always smelling of stale cigar smoke and old dry paper. The gaslight on his desk, it hissed softly, casting long, hungry shadows that danced like ghosts whenever a wagon rolled by outside. He sat behind a big oak desk, the kind that creaked like a tired old man when he leaned on it, which was often. His fingers, thick and yellowed, would drum on the tabletop, waiting for her to speak, but she never did, not unless she had to. He'd flip through a thick, leather-covered ledger book, the pages thin and crackly, filled with neat, cramped handwriting, each line a tally, a sum, a charge. Rent for her tiny space in the tent, the meager food she ate, the lamp oil for her corner, even the cheap grease paint they sometimes made her wear. He'd trace a finger down a column, his lips moving without sound, calculating. "See here, girl," he'd say, not looking up, his voice dry as dust. "Another week, another pile of expenses, you're hardly making a dent in what you owe me. The contract, you remember it, don't you?" He'd tap the page with a blunt nail. "It's all here, clear as day. Your earnings, such as they are, barely cover your keep." He had a way of saying keep that made it sound like she was no more than a penned animal. Lord, it's a cruel thing to have your life written down by someone else, like a grocery list. She stood there, quiet as a shadow, her patterned skin a strange tapestry in the dim light, and she listened. She heard the creak of that desk, the rustle of those papers, the scratch of his pen when he made another mark against her name. He believed those numbers were the Lord's truth, a cage built of ink and paper. He had a way of looking at her, not as a person, but as a sum, a walking calculation. If your worth is only numbers, how do you prove you're a person? The thin blanket was rough against her skin, a poor shield against the chill that always seemed to find its way into the tent corners. She lay there, quiet as a stone in a creek bed, listening to the world outside her small, curtained-off space. The distant, mournful cry of an animal, maybe a lion or a bear, cut through the night, a sound that always felt like a shared loneliness. She thought about Mr. Grimsby and the way his words had wrapped around her life, tightening like a snare. He had a way of speaking about her as if she were a piece of equipment, not a person. Her unique skin, the very thing that made her the patterned enigma, was just another line in his ledger, a number to be added or subtracted. The contract inked with fine black script was more than just paper. It was the bars of her cage, built not of iron, but of promises and legal words she hadn't fully understood when she first put her mark to it. But there wasn't a proper bone in his body when it came to folks like her. He saw her as pure profit. I shake my head slowly, remembering. He didn't care what she thought or what she wanted. Her days were his to command, her movements his to direct. She was to stand, to pose, to be stared at, and that was the lot she was given, fixed by that document. Her future, if you could call it that, was just a longer version of her today, stretching out as far as Grimsby's whims and his hunger for coin would take it. And what does a caged bird truly see when it stares at the bars? She had a quiet way about her, that patterned enigma. Folks thought she was just dreaming, or perhaps too simple to understand the world that gawked at her. But Lord, that was a mistake they kept making one after another. She was building something, I reckon, piece by tiny piece, right under their very noses. Of an evening after the last of the crowds had gone home and the gas lights were turned low, a different kind of life stirred in the circus grounds. The air grew damp with the night dew, and the smells of damp sawdust mixed with the heavy scent of the animals in their stalls. The big cats would sigh in their sleep, a deep, rumbling sound that could make the hair on your arms stand up. It was in these quiet hours that she would slip away. Her steps were lighter than a fallen leaf, barely stirring the scattered hay behind the animal enclosures. There was a little nook back there, tucked away between an old, unused hay wagon and the wall of the elephant tent. It smelled of damp earth and something sharp, like turpentine from a discarded rag someone had left behind. It was not much, just a shadowed space, but it was hers. She found things, you see. Bits of cheap, unused ledger paper, crumpled and tossed aside by the bookkeepers, still holding a blank space or two, a broken quill pen that still had a good point if you held it just so. Sometimes, even a half-dried bottle of ink, thick and black as a winter night. She collected them like a squirrel gathers nuts, each scrap a treasure. Under the faint glow of a faraway lantern, she'd smooth out a piece of that rough paper. Her hands, so often held still for the illustrators, moved with a different kind of purpose now. She'd try to copy a line she'd seen, a curve, a letter from a poster or a ledger page she'd glimpsed. It wasn't easy work, and her fingers would cramp in the cold, but she kept at it. She risked a whipping, or worse, if Grimsby or that Silas caught her. But she kept at it all the same. She was learning to make her own marks, you see, instead of just being marked by others. What secrets can be found in the trash of a busy world? It was late when the last lamp had been doused in the main tent, and the last of the roustabouts had gone to their bedrolls. Grimsby's office was a dark square then, smelling of stale tobacco and old paper, tucked away behind the canvas walls of the big top. The patterned enigma, she waited until the very breath of the circus had quieted, until the only sound was the far-off murmur of the town and the gentle creak of the tent poles in the night wind. She slipped in, quiet as a shadow cast by a dying moon. The air in there hung heavy, thick with the smell of Grimsby's habits. She moved slow, her eyes, used to the dim light of dawn and dusk, scanning the papers piled on his big oak desk. There were legal briefs, some of them still smelling faintly of the acidic ink from the lawyers in the city, laid out like traps. She picked one up, her fingers light, tracing the careful loops and slants of the writing. It was all words, long, twisting words that most folks couldn't make heads or tails of. But she had a way of looking at things, of seeing the bones beneath the skin. They thought she couldn't read, you know, or that she wouldn't understand. That was their biggest mistake, Lord. My own eyes ain't what they used to be, but I can still see a lie a mile off. She wasn't just looking at the letters. She was seeing the threads that tied folks down, the knots that held them fast. She saw the fancy seals, the kind that made a metallic clink when they were pressed into wax, even if she only remembered the sound of them being put away in a distant memory. Every word, every clause, it was a bar on her cage. She looked at the contracts, too, the ones that spoke of ownership and terms of service, words that sounded respectable but meant nothing more than, "You belong to me now." The quiet thrum of a blacksmith's hammer from a distant forge, working late into the night, seemed to beat in time with the sharp pain of understanding she felt. It was all laid out plain, if you knew how to look past the fancy language. The law, it was just another kind of performance, designed to trick folks into believing they had no choice. She spent a long time there, longer than was safe, just soaking it all in, letting the cold, hard truth of those papers settle in her mind. She wasn't looking for a way out yet, not exactly. She was learning the shape of the prison, the way the walls were built, brick by legal brick. Can knowing the enemy's words make you stronger than their chains? The patterned enigma. She worked like a shadow in those late hours, tucked away in her secret nook. It was a small space, barely big enough to stretch out, behind the empty animal stalls where the air hung heavy with the smell of old straw and something wild and sad. She'd found herself a little stub of a candle, and by its flickering light, she would bend over her stolen bits of paper. I pick up the etching again, holding it with both hands, almost reverently. It takes a steady hand to draw a line that holds true, and a steady heart, I reckon, to draw a line that sets you free. My old eyes ain't what they used to be, but I can still see the truth in that. She had her quill pen, a scratchy thing she'd mended herself, and a tiny pot of ink she'd brewed from soot and water. She wasn't just copying letters, you see. She was trying to copy a man's very hand. Mr. Grimsby's signature, that looping, heavy scrawl that held her life in its grip. Over and over she'd try, the quill scratching against the coarse paper, making a sound like a beetle walking on dry leaves. Each time, the line would waver, or the loop would be too round, or the flourish too thin. It wasn't just a name she was trying to forge, it was a piece of his very soul. Ugly as it was, the paper was hard to come by, just scraps she'd found in the trash, and the ink, it was precious. Every failed attempt was a piece of her dwindling hope, a small sigh in the quiet night. Sometimes the little bottle of ink would tip, just a bit, and a dark, smudged blotch would spread across her careful work, ruining it all. She wouldn't cry, not her. She'd just sigh, a sound so soft it was like the wind through the canvas, and start again. That was her way, I reckon. She knew what was at stake, the patterned enigma did. She knew that each piece of ruined paper, each drop of spilled ink, pushed her further from the daylight. How many perfect lies does it take to finally tell the truth? She sat hunched low, where the canvas met the earth, in a place no one thought to look. The oil lamp flickered, throwing shadows that danced like ghosts on the rough canvas walls. Before her lay a small, carefully trimmed piece of parchment, smooth and pale, a stark contrast to the rough world around her. She held a fine quill, dipped in iron gall ink, dark as a winter night. Her breath came slow and steady, but her hand, Lord, it trembled just a bit. She tried to copy Mr. Grimsby's name, a looping, proud scrawl that was meant to hold her fast. Again and again, the quill scratched, a tiny sound in the great quiet of the sleeping circus. The ink would smudge sometimes, or the line would be too thin, or too thick, never quite right. She'd taste the faint, bitter iron on her tongue from an accidental smudge, a reminder of how close she was to spoiling the precious paper. My old hands, they remember that kind of ache, the ache of trying to make something just right, even when everything else feels wrong. I rubbed my knuckles gently, feeling the old bones shift beneath the skin. It wasn't just ink she was spilling. It was her own hope, drop by a careful drop. Each time a letter went wrong, a tiny piece of her heart would sink, I reckon. It felt like she was trying to catch water in a sieve or hold smoke in her fist. The days bled into weeks, and the piles of spoiled parchment grew, small monuments to her failures. Folks thought she was just quiet, but she was fighting a war on paper against a hand that wrote her life away. The damp sawdust smell of the circus even in the quiet hours, seemed to press down on her, a constant reminder of the cage she hoped to escape. She knew, deep down, that her very life, her freedom, hung on getting that name just so. But the more she tried, the more it seemed impossible, like trying to catch a spirit. The true signature, the one on the contract, held all the weight of the world. What if the key to freedom lies in a hand you can never truly copy? That Silas, he was a snake, always looking for trouble, always trying to catch folks out. He saw her quietness as defiance when it was just her way of being. He was one of them folks who believed if you weren't loud, you must be hiding something. The main tent of a warm afternoon wasn't much for privacy, even when the crowds were gone. It still held the damp smell of elephant and stale popcorn, and the faint, sweet scent of newly spread sawdust. Mr. Silas, with his thin lips and sharp eyes, had set up his drawing board right there in the middle, under the biggest gas lamp where the light was unforgiving. He called it capturing the truth, but it felt more like capture itself, I reckon. The patent enigma stood still, like she always did, while Silas worked. Her skin, a wonder to behold, was being measured and marked. He'd lay the cold metal of his calipers right against her arm, or along her cheekbone, and she wouldn't flinch a bit. But you could see it in the way her eyes held steady, never quite meeting his, that she was somewhere else, far away from that tent. He'd make a scratchy sound with his charcoal on the thick paper, then measure again, muttering to himself about the singular nature of her affliction. He wasn't seeing her as a person, you see. He was just counting the patterns, drawing them down for his books, making a specimen of her. He had a way of leaning close, too close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. He'd stare at her hands, then her neck, then her face, like he was trying to find a seam in her skin, a place where the pattern might lift away. Every little movement from her, even just a shift of weight, would earn a sharp look from him, a huff of annoyance. It made her time, the little bit she had for herself, feel like it was shrinking, getting smaller with every rasp of his charcoal. He watched her so hard, it seemed like he could see what she was thinking, what she was planning, and that made her heart beat a little faster, I reckon. It was hard to keep her mind on the lines and loops of Mr. Grimsby's name when Silas was breathing down her neck, trying to draw every inch of her into his own cruel truth. How do you work in secret when every breath is watched? Of an evening after the last of the crowds had shuffled out and the lamps were turned down low, Mr. Grimsby's office would sometimes hold a quiet, steady hum. It wasn't the hum of happy folk, mind you, but more like the buzzing of wasps in a jar. This particular night, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer kept a slow, heavy beat far off in the darkness, a steady clang that seemed to mark the passage of time like a slow-ticking clock. Grimsby sat behind his big oak desk, the kind that always looked too heavy for the floor it rested on. Silas, the man who drew pictures of everything and everyone, stood before him, his voice a low, greasy murmur like oil poured on a cold skillet. He was telling Grimsby about the patterned enigma, about how she kept to herself, how she watched things with eyes that didn't seem to miss a trick, even when she wasn't doing much at all. "She's too quiet, Mr. Grimsby," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried in the still room. "I tell you, there's a look in her eyes sometimes, like she's planning, or like she knows more than she lets on." He laid out a fresh drawing, one of the enigma, but it was just her back, or her hands, not her face. He was trying to show how she moved or didn't move in a way that seemed too thoughtful for a display. Grimsby grunted, pushing a thick ledger book across his desk. The leather binding sighed as it slid. Quiet ain't plotting, Silas. She's paid to be quiet, to be a mystery. That's her lot, and it's a good one for what she is. But even as he said it, his eyes narrowed, picking apart Silas's words like a spider spinning a web. He was always looking for trouble, for a reason to tighten the screws on folks. Silas just nodded. Then he spoke of how he saw her looking at Grimsby's office door, or how she'd sometimes linger near the wagons with the printed papers, as if she could read the words through the wood. He spoke of how she never complained, never asked for more, and how that very silence was, to his mind, the most suspicious thing of all. He had a way of making peace itself sound like a threat. They didn't understand that a still pond can run deep. He was too busy looking for what wasn't there. Grimsby listened, stroking, his chin, his gaze shifting from Silas to the ledger, then back again. The weight of Silas's words settled in the room, making the air thick and heavy. It meant more eyes would be on her now, more whispers, more shadows. It meant her days would be lived under a constant, watchful cloud. What happens when suspicion becomes a shadow that follows your every move? I hold the etching up, turning it over and over as if seeking an answer in its faded lines. She knew time was running out. That feeling like a tightening knot in your chest, I remember it well. That's the feeling of a clock running down, and you still ain't done what you set out to do. It was late at night in her little nook behind the animal stalls. The air was thick with the smell of damp straw and a faint hint of that tobacco Silas smoked, clinging to everything like a bad memory. She had only a stub of a candle, flickering low, making shadows dance like ghosts on the rough canvas walls. Her hands moved, quick but careful, over the blank paper. She was practicing Mr. Grimsby's hand, you see, the way he scrawled his name on the ledgers, making sure every loop and every scratch was just so. It had to be perfect. One wrong curve, and it would all be for naught. She was bent low, her patterned skin catching the weak light, when a sound ripped through the quiet. A creak. Not just any creak, but the heavy, slow groan of a floorboard from the main tent, right outside her curtain. Her heart jumped like a frog in a well. Silas. It had to be him, making his rounds, trying to catch folks out after hours. He always did, Lord. He just loved to see trouble. She snatched up the paper, the quill, the little bottle of ink, and shoved them all under a loose board in the floor. Her breath hitched, quiet as a mouse. She flattened herself against the canvas, making herself small, hardly daring to breathe. The smell of that pipe tobacco grew stronger, closer. She could hear his heavy boots, slow and dragging, coming right past her nook. Every muscle in her body was tight, like a bowstring drawn too far. She could almost feel his eyes on the curtain, searching, always searching for something out of place. He paused, I reckon, right there, just stood. It felt like an hour, though it was likely only a few heartbeats. The candle flickered, casting her mosaic skin in shifting patterns, but she didn't dare move to snuff it out. He'd hear. He'd know. Then, with a final, drawn-out creak, the footsteps moved on, fading away into the damp night. She waited, long after the sound was gone. until the silence felt safe again, if silence can ever truly be safe in a place like that. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands trembled just a little as she reached down to pull out her hidden tools. The paper was still there, safe, but the quiet had a new edge to it now, a sharper, colder edge. She knew time was running out, and the walls were closing in, tighter than ever before. When the walls close in, how much closer can freedom be? I reckon it means you just got to work harder, smarter, and faster, Lord. It's what she did. And this here etching, this picture they meant to cage her with, she turned it into a key, didn't she? A quiet, steady hand, that's all it took. I can still feel the faint lines of it under my thumb, worn smooth by time. But the story it tells, that ain't faded one bit. No, that story it's etched deep, like the lines on my own old hands.